Hi everyone, welcome back. In today's video, we're going to be talking about Gothic literature, and in particular, the reasons why I think Gothic literature is a genre that you should read. For those of you familiar with the genre, please let me know in the comments below what are the things you enjoy most about Gothic literature. But for now, you're going to listen to me tell you what I like about the genre, so let's get started. One thing that strikes me about Gothic literature is that despite having its ghouls and goblins and other supernatural forces, actually, Gothic literature is really good at capturing the reality of just normal, run-of-the-mill nature. Gothic fiction in its original form stemmed from Romanticism, and that movement of fiction has a tendency to romanticize nature and make it somewhat beautiful and prettified and focus on those aspects, and ignore the ugly side of nature or the dark side of nature. One thing that I think Gothic fiction does is it brings that dark side in. It gets into the heart of the crueler aspects of nature, not just the beautiful. There are three that stand out in my mind when thinking of this topic. In terms of Gothic classics, we have things like Bram Stoker's Dracula and Anne Radcliffe's The Mysteries of Udolpho. Both of those writers, Bram Stoker in the opening scenes when Jonathan Harker is going to Castle Dracula, and Anne Radcliffe pretty much throughout the entire novel of The Mysteries of Udolpho, they capture the huge vastness of nature and how beautiful it is, but at the same time, they're willing to show how terrifying it can be in certain situations, especially when you're alone and vulnerable. And I really like how they delve into that. They're not afraid to show how cruel and deadly nature can be, as well as beautiful. This is also something you see in more modern incarnations of Gothic fiction or horror fiction. The example here that stands out in my mind is The Shining by Stephen King. The setting of the Overlook Hotel is somewhat like a modern reimagining of Castle Dracula. You have this huge sprawling hotel which is somewhat similar to a castle, surrounded in this vast isolated landscape, which again is depicted in a very beautiful and sublime way, but at the same time it's terrifying for the people, for the protagonists, who are going to be isolated there. Of course, other genres do focus on these things. It's not like Gothic fiction has a monopoly on this, but I do think of all of the genres that I've read, Gothic fiction takes the cake when it comes to depicting that dichotomy between the beauty and the terribleness or ugliness of nature. This somewhat stems from the previous reason that I gave, which was to do with nature on a grander scale, but now I want to talk about human nature in particular. Gothic literature and horror is one of the few genres that's really not afraid to go there when it comes to depicting those dark, cruel aspects of human nature. Even when you have mythical creatures like vampires or ghouls or devils, these things are often just metaphors for certain cruel aspects of the human psyche. You can definitely see this with vampires, with the whole bloodlust thing, but also werewolves, the whole idea of a predator. All of those things are just aspects of human beings reflected into mythology and evil. At the moment though, I don't actually want to talk about the supernatural, we'll get to that later. I actually just want to focus on realism itself, because I think that even though Gothic fiction does have the supernatural elements, it's also very good at being very realistic, and there are quite a few novels I can give as examples. Some of the best parts of Ray Bradbury's Something Wicked This Way come from the very real setting in which the story takes place. You feel very connected to those characters and what they're going through, and that's before any supernatural stuff occurs. It's to do with their families and their relationships with each other. Another good example again would be The Shining, and the way that Jack Torrance's psychology plays into the supernatural elements that go around him. But probably the best example that I have of this would be something like Heathcliff from Wuthering Heights. Again, you've got this character that's just so cruel and terrible and evil, and a lot of people find that novel that they can't relate to it, they think it's too extreme. But actually I think that in all these cases, what Gothic writers are doing is they're just delving into those extremes. They're willing to go there and look at how terrible and cruel people can be. And while that might be unbelievable sometimes, because most people don't behave in that way, because it's rare that we're pushed to those extremes, sometimes it does happen, and it's great that Gothic writers do tend to explore those themes, and it's very interesting to see as a reader. So obviously when it comes to modern horror, it's often regarded as a subgenre, it's niche, and people tend to look down on it as a serious genre of fiction. Things like Bram Stoker's Dracula were panned in their time, so was Wuthering Heights, and so were novels like Lewis's The Monk, even though they cause controversy. Now a lot of this comes from the topics that these novels tend to take. They tend to be quite gory, they tend to be quite sexual in certain ways, so it's obvious why people would want to suppress them. I think it's because of this way that Gothic has been overlooked. That's what allows the authors to get into topics that involve a lot of gore or violence or terror. It's a genre that allows the writers to do those interesting things, take on these difficult topics, because it doesn't matter, you don't have any standards to live up to, because you're not necessarily going to get that respect anyway from the wider literary circles. I think it's got to be undisputable almost. I think it's pretty much indisputable that when you think about villains in literature, the Gothic genre is going to be king in terms of producing some of the best of the best. First of all, you've got those huge, big forces of darkness villains like Count Dracula, but then at the same time you've got flawed villains, tragic villains like Dorian Gray or Dr. Jekyll or Dr. Frankenstein. You just can't beat these villains, whether it's the sympathetic or the big force of darkness. Even the more one-note Gothic villains like Dracula, who's just, big force of darkness baddie, even they can inspire fear and have an air of mystery to them that makes you want to go back to the book and makes you want to find out more about them. It says a lot about the power of the villains in these stories that they've been able to endure so long over time. It's definitely quite common for authors to prefer to explain everything when it comes to their plot. Not necessarily during the novel, but at the end they want to have that resolution, they want the magic system if it's a fantasy to be explained, or they want the plot and all the mysteries to be wrapped up. This isn't true of every novel by any stretch, but there are certainly some genres that allow for more mystery and more intrigue than others. And the Gothic genre definitely sits on the side of mystery and intrigue. Gothic literature is always willing to embrace mystery, and this can be great as a reader because then there are always things that you can rediscover when you read the text again. Angela Carter springs to mind as an author who is especially good at mystery and symbolism. Her short story collection, The Bloody Chamber, is something that I read maybe 10 years ago now, and it's still a collection that I come back to time and time again because there's just so much in that material. There's so many metaphors, so many layers of mystery, and there's just so much to be discovered about them. And this is something that applies to other Gothic greats. Dracula himself is a character that represents people's fear of other cultures, people coming from other places. Dorian Gray's aging portrait is meant to represent the amorality of art. And Dr. Frankenstein's story tells us something about the dangers of scientific inquiry at the expense of other values, such as moral value. It just demonstrates so much creativity that people can come up with these creatures, or monsters, or supernatural storylines, which then have parallels in the real world. It makes for a much more interesting story for me, especially in terms of rereading, because there's always more to find. Not all Gothic fiction does this though. I mean, Anne Radcliffe, who is one of the giants in terms of Gothic fiction, she loves to give rational explanations to everything in her novels. At least that's true in The Mysteries of Rodolfo. But even then, throughout that book, so much of it is mystery, and she doesn't even show you some of the more graphic violence because she wants to keep things suspenseful. She doesn't want to just reveal everything right away. And I think that Gothic tendency to keep things secret and keep things shrouded, and sometimes not even resolve plots, is an asset to the genre, and it makes it so much more interesting. And like I said, it makes me want to reread those books over and over again. Gothic fiction is definitely a genre that has never been particularly precious when it comes to its protagonists or antagonists. 9 times out of 10, the person that we're following is not going to have a happy ever after at the end of the novel. Of all the genres, I do think that Gothic fiction is definitely one of the most flippant when it comes to hacking off characters here and there, and isn't really bothered about good guys winning at the end all the time. I'm thinking here of stories like The Monk by Matthew Lewis, or Zofloya by Charlotte Dacre. Both of those stories, in terms of the protagonists, they do not have a happy ever after by any means, and the final scenes, especially of The Monk, some of the most harrowing and brutal that I've ever seen when it comes to the end of a protagonist. Also, in some of the books, even when the protagonist does die, it's not always a tragic ending where the hero is sort of redeemed. Sometimes, in the case of The Monk, for instance, the character is damned, that's just the end, and it's just completely bleak. And then other times you have stories like Dorian Gray maybe, or Frankenstein, where the protagonist is somewhat redeemed, and then you have ones like Wuthering Heights, where when Heathcliff dies, it's ambivalent, you're not really sure whether he's redeemed himself, maybe he has, maybe he hasn't, maybe that's the point that there's no redemption in that novel. I just really enjoy that Gothic literature just goes there when it comes to dealing with its protagonists. It's not willing to just give them happy endings all the time. It's not even willing to redeem them all the time. And this comes back again to some of the other things that I was saying about the ways in which Gothic literature will balance the light and the dark sides of things. Sometimes good will win, and that's great, but other times the darkness will win, or sometimes it will be somewhere in between. This is great because as a reader, I often don't know where the novel is going to be going and what will happen to the protagonist at the end. Even the most virtuous character in a Gothic novel is a liable victim for death, just as the evil person is liable to, seize the day and win ultimately. So there you have it. Here are the main reasons why I think Gothic literature is just fantastic, and hopefully I've given you some inspiration to get out there and start reading Gothic literature for yourself. In my next video on Gothic literature, I'm thinking of doing a guide to the genre, so if this video has interested you in getting more into the genre, be on the lookout for that. I'll be providing some good places to start with that genre, so definitely be on the lookout for that video in the near future. Okay, that's it for today's video. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. I post new videos every Monday and Thursday, 4 PM UK time. Let me know in the comments below, what do you think of Gothic literature, and if you love the genre, please let me know what are your favourite things about the genre. If you don't love it, also let me know why you don't like it, because it's always fun to have a debate. As for now, that's it for me, so take care guys, and I'll see you all in the next video.